there were many, many different kinds of practice questions. So it seemed to me that that was a big question for a lot of people. So we have some practice questions first, and then we have some other questions that I thought would be interesting for the group. And we had some really specific theological questions, so those are sort of toward the end of the pile here, and let's see how far we get, okay? So the first question that came up is, can you mix the two practices? Say according to your mood or to the time of the day, can you use centering prayer perhaps in the morning and then Christian meditation in the afternoon?
That sounds like an English compromise. I think probably the mindset behind that question needs to be clarified, I would say. You know, people are free to do what they like, actually, and let the Spirit guide you. But my suggestion, based on what I understand from really kind of a universal tradition of wisdom, is to simplify, to keep your practice simple. And I think it's important to have a foundational contemplative practice, one that you go deeper and deeper into, that you love, that you work with. And the deeper you go into it, the more you are able to appreciate the wisdom of other paths, and not necessarily practicing them, but learning from them or being enriched by your knowledge of them. So I don't think it's about exclusion, but I think it's about commitment to a basic simplicity and fidelity.
Mm-hmm. Thomas?
Yeah, well, it shouldn't surprise us that there are different methods with a slightly different emphasis, and perhaps one or other is more suitable for the particular temperamental predispositions that each of us has. I'm really amazed as I meet more people and my own practice continues to evolve. I'm still only at the beginning of this process. It's a long trip from zero to infinity. So whatever we accomplish in this life is still half of nothing. But some practices are more concentrated than others and involve the use of the faculties more. And there's kind of a spectrum. I have a little diagram of this. I think it's still in the Intimacy with God. But some are more receptive. And ultimately, if they're working, they'll all become receptive in the end. But you may need to start at a slightly more concentrated spot. And so a lot depends on what your previous experience has been. You may have been in Eastern method, so you have a significant psychological base already to work from. But I think centering prayer is about as receptive, if you practice it according to the proposed teaching of contemplative outreach, as you can get. That doesn't mean that that's the best process for everyone. Some may need to start with a mantric kind of prayer. And as you know, if you've studied the guidelines of centering prayer, we speak of the discrete use of the sacred word or the sacred breath or the sacred glance, all of which are legitimate approaches to the same mystery that concentrative practices are moving towards. And I don't think they're opposed in any way. They may, I think, all our methods are preparatory to no method, which is when the Spirit of God takes over the prayer from start to finish. And that's not exactly a method, but a presence and a relationship that transcends all technique and method. So I agree very much with Laurence that it's good to stay with one for a while, because whichever you do is going to become, if it's working, more and more receptive, and you may feel more comfortable with one than another. But even within centering prayer, some people are never quite comfortable with the sacred word, as we call it. It makes them feel they're too much in their head. And so they prefer following the breath, not as a physiological way by thinking of how the nostrils dilate and the diaphragm expands, not that kind of breathing attention, which is used sometimes in Eastern methods of meditation, but it's rather just noticing the breath as briefly as possible. So remember, the sacred symbol in centering prayer is just a gesture of what the will is doing. And perhaps that brings us to a discussion of what is meant by intention, attention.
Mm-hmm. Just before we go, I agree. John Main always said there are no methods in prayer, because when he was speaking about prayer there, he was coming back to the basic theology that all Christian prayer is an entry into the prayer of Christ. That we, just as we say, or St. Paul says, I live no longer, but Christ lives in me, we could say, I pray no longer, but Christ prays in me. So that's the unity that we share. Contemplation, obviously. I think if you go back to Cassian, the conferences of Cassian, John Cassian was this great 5th century monk who had absorbed the wisdom of the desert fathers and mothers and brought it to the Western Church and became a huge influence on St. Benedict. And for 1,000 years in the Western Church, Cassian was read every day in the refectory according to the rule of St. Benedict. So it really permeated the Western mind. And Cassian was on the desk of Aquinas as he wrote the Summa Theologica and so on. So Cassian is really very much at the heart of the Western spiritual tradition. And it was through his reading of Cassian, based on his earlier experience of meditation in the universal tradition that he'd found in the East many years before, that kind of begun the awakening for him. But John Main saw in Cassian, the 10th conference and the 10th chapter, this method of the formula, as he calls it, the repetition of the verse, the single verse, which he speaks about as the poverty of a single verse. And this is also a great point of unity, I think, between the Eastern Church and the Western Church, because Cassian obviously precedes the big division between Orthodoxy and the Latin Church. And anyway, there he describes, and I think this is relevant to, well, it's a distinction perhaps too, in the saying of the mantra, in the way that John Main would teach, based on his reading of Cassian, I think people experience what the Hesychast tradition explains, what Cassian explains. You discover it in your own experience as you stand in the supermarket line, as you're waiting for the bus or you're sitting in a traffic jam. You find that the word quite naturally comes to the surface of your mind. It becomes rooted in the heart. Now that rooting of process of the mantra, that might take us to what you're saying about what you were raising just then about intention and attention, because it seems to me to be a fairly natural, a very natural, organic process. You can give it a little push, you can help it, but it isn't like a hard drive. You're not forcing yourself to say the word continually. And I think it awakens a sense of praying without ceasing. And what that means, to come back to the basic theology, is not that we are praying consciously, saying words or thinking all the time, but that the Spirit is continuously praying in us. And we can be aware of that at a level of consciousness that doesn't interfere with the daily levels of awareness, paying your bills, going to work, dealing with problems. It's another level of awareness that pervades all the other practical levels.
It seems to me what you're saying, Father Laurence, and my understanding anyway, is that, for example, in centering prayer, we would recommend that people use the sacred word during their centering prayer period, but not during other times of the day. And that during other times of the day, they would take up a phrase, and we would call that an active prayer sentence, which would be a different prayer. But it seems to me that this, at least from my understanding of what you're saying, that as this mantra gets rooted in your heart, it begins to say itself, so in a way that comes to mind in every situation, or in many situations during the course of the day.
It's a constant awareness. It's not that, it's not like having a divided consciousness, but if you look at the way of the pilgrim,
Yes.
when he's asking, how can I pray continuously? And he goes to many priests and wise people, and nobody can tell him. And then somebody introduces him to the Jesus prayer. And the first thing they say is, the first thing he has to do is to say it 7,000 times a day. I don't know how you just count that on your beads, I suppose. But then he said he found that it entered the heart and it began to sort of say itself. And then the consequences of that, I think he says, he began to look upon everybody he met with love. Mm-hmm. His humble peasant hut that he lived in seemed like a palace. Mm-hmm. And it had become a treasure, the greatest treasure of his life, something like that. So it's yes, I think if you approach it, if you approach the sacred word or the mantra in that way, I think it would lead to that quite naturally. Mm-hmm. And as I say, you can help it along a little bit. If you're sitting waiting for the dentist to attack you, it's wonderful. And Cassian says when you go to sleep at night, he says, this is what he said too. He said, I found that I would go to sleep at night saying it and wake up in the morning saying it.
Yeah, Father Basil.
So I think it's another aspect of it, and there are obviously advantages and riches to be found in other approaches.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
The basic practice, wouldn't you say, is the presence of God. Mm. That is to say, the awareness. In fact, St. John of the Cross says somewhere that human health consists in the continuous, conscious presence of God.
Yeah.
That's a very powerful description of what Paul, it seems, means by praying without ceasing. It doesn't mean words, it doesn't mean images, it doesn't mean particular acts, it means a sense of this deeper presence that is sometimes described as the thing saying itself. It isn't saying itself, it doesn't know how to talk, but it seems as though something else is keeping you in the presence.
It's a sacrament, really, isn't it?
And it's effortless.
It's a kind
most of the time. Then when you're in trouble, you may have to say it in a special way, somewhat the way we recommended welcoming prayer in different circumstances.
Yeah, and any method, if you want to, and there are methods, any method is really designed simply to make us present to the presence, isn't it? Yeah.
Yes, I've heard some people say that when the going gets rough, they hear bad news or something, their sacred word just automatically appears and it reminds them of the presence of God in the situation. So it just comes because of the practice. So I think in that case it would be, again, that reminder that you are in the presence and that you don't have to really, you're supported.
And for me it's very Eucharistic. From a Catholic perspective, with our understanding of the Eucharist, it seems to me part of it, well, the early teacher said there were three liturgies: the liturgy of heaven, the liturgy of the altar, celebrated this morning here, and the liturgy of the heart. and they're basically the same presence manifesting in different forms. And just as we need signs. Maybe there are no signs in the liturgy of heaven, except the presence itself. It is beyond the world of forms altogether. But in the heart or in the congregation, then there are sacramental signs. I see this as a kind of inner sacrament, really.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So let's return to your one of the things that you began to speak about, Father Thomas, and there happens to be a question here regarding intention and attention. And it says, would it be fair to say that centering prayer is a prayer of intention to consent, while Christian meditation is a prayer of attention to consent? And is there a distinction between the two? Can you explain the differences and the similarities?
Well, first of all, in spiritual conversation, it's one has to be careful not to make black and white distinctions. And there's a great deal of overlapping. For instance, what the Buddhists, Hindus call mindfulness doesn't mean it excludes the heart. But in Hebrew, the word heart includes both mind and heart. But if you don't know that, it sounds to us in our somewhat overly distinction-prone age to think of as totally separate. They overlap. It's a question of emphasis that is similar to the emphasis on a little more concentration or a little more receptivity. But the receptivity includes some attention. Like, if you recall Open Mind, Open Heart, there's a whole chapter on what I call the cultivation of spiritual attentiveness, which is slightly different from attention. And at the time I wrote the book, I was thinking of the kind of attention that some self-help practices, especially inspired by the Eastern traditions, were promoting, and that was to do what you're doing and to eat what you're eating and to see the tree that you're looking at and even to describe the psychological processes like thinking. Vipassana has that practice. Walking, thinking, talking. Just so you're aware the distinction between the deep you and the particular practice you're in. Now, this is a very useful technique. The only trouble with it for Christians is that of itself it's non-relational, so it has slight tendency maybe to increase the possibility of exercising one's spiritual practice as an ego trip. Always possible as long as you have a false self, which is usually a long time. So, but you have to start somewhere. And you're going to make mistakes all the time. It doesn't matter. It's just try again. and so attention, if it's to an image or an object like a candle or icons have a special kind of devotion and technique that is a little different here, so I'm not thinking of icon worship as in the Eastern Orthodox tradition, but of looking at a devotional object like the cross or Mary or something. All of these things are helpful, but what is most helpful is not the thing itself, but the intention with which we're doing that. It seems to me in Christianity, intention is everything. And the intention for everything is meant to be the pure love of God. That is to say, as St. Teresa puts it, to do everything for God alone and to do nothing for self or for creatures. So that's perhaps the development of an immense purification of the heart. So centering prayer is sometimes thought of as heartfulness, not as opposed to mindfulness, but as an emphasis on the relational quality in Christianity as distinct, not opposed, to the revelation of the Eastern religions, which is more about the psychology of the spiritual journey and how it's experienced, at least in the Buddhist tradition, which has very highly developed teaching on the formation of the individual self, or what we call the false self. So to consent to God's presence in action, which is the primary discipline in centering prayer, is to have this intention of love, of opening at 360 degrees to the divine presence. Now, I'm sure that the Cashin's method has the same project, but it starts at a slightly different place, because as soon as you stop thinking deliberately of a particular subject, up comes 10 years or 50 years of projects the imagination has wanted to talk about and never had permission, because you were thinking of something definite or specific. Now it's its chance, and so it floods you with all the things that it has have been waiting in line for the whatever number of years you've been waiting. So the first few weeks, months, or couple of years can be unbelievable, the amount of nonsense that goes through your head. But now, because you're deliberately watching it or noticing it, it seems like you're getting worse. You're not getting worse, just finding out how bad off you always were. So to emphasize attention is a marvelous mental discipline. To emphasize intention is a marvelous relational cultivation of God as love in some form. Now, somehow the two begin to come together at some point, so they're not opposed. And just which is better to begin with for a particular person may depend on cultural background and personality traits and all those unpredictables. God seems to love diversity. After all, he's infinitely diverse, or the divine essence, whatever pronoun you attribute to it. And so, well, maybe you have some further comment on that.
No, thank you. No, it's a good area for us to disagree on. It's not really a disagreement. I agree with what you said. I think they must come together, and it's where you place the emphasis or articulate the difference. It seems to me that attention is the essence of love. That if you love someone, you're paying attention to them. You may not be thinking about them all the time, and you may not be intending to do anything for them specifically. But your attention, I think, when a man or a woman goes to work and they're separated during the day, they are still loving each other, they're not thinking about each other, but then, and in that sense, there is a place in them, or a level in them, which is attentive to the other. And that makes a difference to the way they live and to the way they do their work, because if they didn't have that loving relationship in their life, they wouldn't be so happy, wouldn't feel so secure, they wouldn't feel so peaceful. So attention, I think, is different from concentration. Actually, I would say concentration, it would seem to me, is where you do deliberately and intentionally, perhaps, focus on something or someone for a particular purpose, and that is also an act of love. It may be an act of love, of course. It may not be, depends on what you're intending, but it's similarly, I think, moving us away from the egocentric level of consciousness. I think that's the vital thing that happens. I find it easier to understand. It's impossible to understand really, but I find it a little easier to understand through or from the perspective of attention, because human experience is constantly teaching us this. When you pay attention to someone, you are giving them something. You're giving them yourself, your very self. That's why it's so difficult to pay attention. I mean, and if you're paying attention to what Thomas and I are saying now, that's a great gift that you're giving us. And we're only speaking in order to pay attention to you. And that means the mutual attention is not egocentric. The mutual attention is the spirit. I think it's the mind of the spirit. And that's why we can say that the teacher here among us is Jesus, the teacher within. So, but the active attention is a very powerful in terms of human relationships. It's a very powerful transformative act, because when you do listen to someone, whether they have just been in bereavement or they are going through a hard time, or whatever, if you just listen to them, and you're not just listening to them with the intention, say, of solving their problems or giving them advice, but primarily you're paying attention to them for its own sake, just to be with them and for them, there is a transfer of some kind of center of consciousness or energy of love, or a gift of self, really. It's a laying down of one's life for one's brothers and sisters. And that, when you realize that somebody has really listened to you, what do you feel? You feel better. Better about yourself, you feel better able to deal with your problems. You may not have the solution, but you can deal with them better. So that's why I think contemplative prayer makes us feel better and makes us able to live better in the world and become more loving people. The test, ultimately, of any contemplative practice is, does it make us a more loving person? And I think that's how I would understand it. I find it easier to understand through this question of attention. But to get to attention, you have to have an intention. You have to make a deliberate choice to do it. Otherwise, and that, I think, in the early stages of any contemplative practice, as in any human relationship, you have to work at it and push beyond the initial romantic stage or the eros stage of a relationship or of a commitment when you're very enthusiastic and it's easy. Beyond that stage, you do have to hang in there, and there is an intention to stay in there. So I think the words are, the two words are very friendly words to each other, because they can be used differently, but they reveal something about each other.
Yes, well, I liked your distinction very much. I thought it was very helpful for this discussion between attention and concentration. Concentration implies a lot more effort,
Yes.
and hence a lot more egoic activity into the process of attention.
Yeah.
So perhaps this is not the right distinction we're making,
Yes.
or juxtaposition between attention and attention.